Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my commentary today. A single truth social post composed in characteristically blunt language and published without warning to diplomats or allies has fundamentally altered the relationship between the United States and Africa's most industrialized economy. President Donald Trump's announcement that South Africa would be barred from attending the 2026 G20 summit and that all American aid would cease immediately represents one of the most dramatic ruptures in US-Africa relations in modern history. The decision arrived not through careful diplomatic channels or after lengthy interagency deliberation, but through social media catching even Trump's own State Department largely unprepared. Within hours, the rand-tumbled South African officials convened emergency meetings and foreign ministries from Beijing to Brussels scrambled to understand the implications. What had begun as a diplomatic protocol dispute at a summit closing ceremony had escalated into a full-scale geopolitical confrontation that threatens to accelerate the very multipolar fragmentation that American strategists have long sought to contain. The relationship between the United States and South Africa has always carried weight far beyond the bilateral, given South Africa's unique position as both Africa's most developed economy and the continent's sole representative in the G20. Since the end of apartheid in 1994, American engagement with South Africa has been substantial, multifaceted, and generally positive, encompassing trade partnerships worth billions annually, security cooperation on regional stability issues and development assistance addressing everything from HIV/AIDS treatment to educational infrastructure. American aid to South Africa, while smaller than assistance to some other African nations in absolute terms, has been strategically targeted and symbolically significant, reaching approximately $500–700 million annually through programs including the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, USAID development initiatives, and various State Department programs supporting civil society and governance. South Africa's G20 membership, granted in 1999 when the forum expanded beyond the G7 to include major emerging economies, represents far more than South African participation alone. As the only African nation with permanent membership in this crucial forum for global economic coordination, South Africa serves as the voice for an entire continent of 1.4 billion people in discussions shaping international financial regulation, trade policy, development, financing, and climate response. The symbolism of this representation cannot be overstated in a global system where Africa has historically been excluded from decision-making tables despite representing a significant and growing share of the world population and resources. Trump's decision to exclude South Africa from the 2026 summit therefore reverberates far beyond bilateral relations, effectively silencing African perspectives during a year when critical decisions about global economic governance will be made. The timing of Trump's decision carries additional significance. The move comes as developing nations increasingly question the legitimacy of Western-dominated international institutions, as BRICS expands to include new members seeking alternatives to traditional power structures, and as competition between the United States and China for influence across the global south intensifies. In this context, Trump's exclusion of South Africa from the G20 and termination of aid represents not merely bilateral punishment, but a broader statement about American willingness to weaponize institutional access and economic relationships to enforce alignment with Washington's preferences. The immediate catalyst for Trump's decision traces to the closing ceremony of the 2025 G20 summit, held in Johannesburg under South Africa's rotating presidency. According to established G20 protocol, the conclusion of each summit includes a symbolic handover, where the outgoing host nation transfers ceremonial presidency to a representative of the next year's host. With the United States scheduled to host the 2026 summit, Trump's administration had designated Secretary of State Marco Rubio to receive this handover during the Johannesburg ceremony. However, in a move that caught American officials by surprise and infuriated Trump personally, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa declined to perform the traditional handover ceremony, instead delivering closing remarks that emphasized collective G20 responsibility without acknowledging the American transition or recognizing Secretary Rubio's presence. South African officials later explained that the decision reflected consultations with other G20 members who felt that emphasizing any single nation's leadership contradicted the forum's multilateral spirit, particularly given rising tensions over American unilateralism on trade and climate issues. Yet American observers interpreted the move quite differently, seeing calculated disrespect orchestrated to diminish Washington's standing, possibly coordinated with BRICS partners seeking to undermine American prestige. The protocol breach, while seemingly minor, struck directly at Trump's documented sensitivity to questions of respect status and American precedence in international forums. His reaction was immediate and maximalist. If South Africa would publicly slight American leadership, then South Africa would discover the costs of such choices through exclusion and economic pressure. Yet the handover incident represented merely the spark that ignited longer accumulated tensions. Trump and his foreign policy team had grown increasingly frustrated with South Africa's foreign policy trajectory over recent years, viewing Pretoria's positions as consistently opposed to American interests despite ongoing American assistance. South Africa's refusal to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its participation in joint naval exercises with Russian and Chinese forces, its vocal support for Palestinian causes over Israeli security concerns, and its leading role in expanding BRICS membership all contributed to a perception in Washington that South Africa had effectively chosen sides in an emerging great power competition and that those sides were not American ones. From the Trump administration's perspective, continuing hundreds of millions in annual aid to a nation actively working to build alternative power structures designed to diminish American influence represented strategic incoherence that demanded correction. South African officials rejected this framing entirely, arguing that Pretoria's foreign policy reflected genuine non-alignment rather than anti-American positioning. They emphasized that South Africa maintained significant economic relationships with Western partners, that criticism of specific American policies did not constitute blanket opposition to the United States, and that exercising sovereign judgment on international issues was a fundamental right of independent nations. The G20 protocol decision from Pretoria's perspective reflected legitimate concerns about American unilateralism, shared by multiple member states, not personal disrespect toward Trump. Moreover, South African officials argued that BRICS participation represented diversification of partnerships appropriate for any nation seeking to maximize its options in a multipolar world, not rejection of Western relationships. These competing narratives, fundamentally incompatible in their basic premises about whether nations can truly maintain non-alignment or must ultimately choose sides, made collision increasingly inevitable. If this explanation of both the immediate trigger and the underlying tensions clarifies how seemingly minor diplomatic incidents can escalate when they occur against the backdrop of fundamental strategic disagreements, hitting the like button helps this analysis reach others seeking to understand these complex dynamics. The reverberations of Trump's decision spread across Africa with remarkable speed and uncommon unity, revealing depths of continental solidarity that often remain latent during normal diplomatic circumstances. Within 48 hours of Trump's announcement, the African Union issued a strongly worded statement describing the American action as an assault on African representation in global governance and calling for member states to demonstrate continental unity in response. This African Union position reflected genuine, widespread concern across the continent that went far beyond support for South Africa's specific government or policies. African nations understood intuitively that South Africa's G20 exclusion represented more than bilateral punishment. It constituted effective silencing of the only African voice in a crucial forum for global economic decision-making. Nigerian President Bola Tinubu convened an emergency meeting of West African leaders to discuss coordinated response options, emphasizing that what happened to South Africa could theoretically happen to any African nation that displeased Washington. Kenyan officials, despite Kenya's generally pro-Western orientation and significant American economic and security partnerships, issued statements expressing deep concern about the precedent of excluding nations from multilateral forums based on foreign policy disagreements. Even nations with complicated relationships with South Africa, including Zimbabwe and some other southern African states, found themselves compelled to express solidarity given the broader principle at stake. The message from across the continent was remarkably consistent, regardless of individual nations' views about South African foreign policy choices or the specific G20 protocol dispute. The principle that African representation in global forums could be unilaterally revoked by Western powers was unacceptable and required collective response. This continental solidarity manifested in several concrete ways beyond rhetorical support. African nations began discussing the possibility of rotating which African nation would speak on behalf of the continent at the 2026 G20 summit, with Nigeria and Egypt both indicating willingness to use their economic weight and international standing to ensure African perspectives were heard even if South Africa was excluded. The African Union fast-tracked discussions about creating an African position paper on G20 agenda items that any attending African representatives could present, effectively ensuring that South Africa's exclusion would not silence African voices entirely. More significantly, the controversy accelerated long-simmering discussions about African nations' vulnerability to Western economic coercion and the need for greater continental self-sufficiency in development financing, trade relationships, and institutional frameworks. The Trump decision inadvertently strengthened arguments made by Pan-African advocates who had long contended that African nations needed to reduce dependencies on Western aid, development assistance, and institutional access that could be weaponized during future disputes. Proposals for expanding intra-African trade through the African Continental Free Trade Area gained new urgency. Discussions about African participation in BRICS-led initiatives, including the new development bank and alternative payment systems, accelerated as nations concluded that diversification, away from exclusive reliance on Western-dominated institutions, was not merely ideologically desirable, but strategically necessary. The irony was palpable. Trump's attempt to punish South Africa for drifting toward BRICS and away from Western alignment had the effect of pushing the entire continent to question its relationship with Western institutions and consider alternatives that previously seemed too risky or premature to embrace fully. Understanding the depth of African solidarity in response to Trump's decision requires appreciating how colonial history and post-independence experiences shape continental perspectives on sovereignty and external coercion. If you're finding this analysis valuable and are grateful for coverage that examines African perspectives beyond Western media narratives, I genuinely appreciate hearing from you in the comments below. Your feedback, particularly from African viewers who can provide first-hand perspective on how this controversy is being received continentally, helps me understand which aspects of these geopolitical developments deserve deeper exploration. The immediate economic impact of Trump's decision struck South Africa across multiple dimensions, revealing both genuine vulnerabilities and unexpected resilience. The termination of approximately $700 million in annual American aid represented a significant but not catastrophic loss for an economy with GDP approaching $400 billion. The aid cuts would directly affect programs serving millions of South Africans, particularly in healthcare, where American-funded HIV/AIDS treatment reaches over 2 million people, and in education, where various USAID programs support thousands of schools and training institutions. South African officials scrambled to identify alternative funding sources for these programs, recognizing that sudden termination would create immediate hardship for vulnerable populations and potentially trigger domestic political backlash against the government's foreign policy choices. However, the broader economic implications extended beyond direct aid losses. Financial markets reacted nervously to the geopolitical confrontations, with the rand depreciating approximately 4 to 6% in initial trading. Following Trump's announcement, as currency traders factored in increased political risk and potential complications for South African companies operating in American markets. Foreign investors, always sensitive to political stability and international relationships, began reassessing South African risk premiums, potentially affecting everything from sovereign bond yields to equity valuations. South African companies with significant American business relationships, including mining firms, financial institutions, and technology companies, faced immediate questions about whether the bilateral rupture would complicate their operations or expose them to additional scrutiny from American regulators. Yet South Africa's economic position was less vulnerable than Trump's decisions seemed to assume, a reality that quickly became apparent as markets stabilized and South African officials outlined their response strategy. Trade between the United States and South Africa, while significant at approximately $20 billion annually, represented a smaller share of South Africa's total trade than relationships with China, the European Union, and other African nations combined. South African exports to America, including minerals, vehicles, and agricultural products, would theoretically remain subject to existing trade arrangements under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, though Trump's decision raised questions about whether that access might also face termination. Importantly, South African imports from America could potentially be replaced through alternative sources, particularly from China, which had long sought to expand its economic footprint in South Africa. The financial assistance gap created by terminated American aid, meanwhile, attracted immediate attention from alternative sources. Within days of Trump's announcement, Chinese officials indicated willingness to expand development cooperation with South Africa, offering financing for infrastructure projects and assistance programs that could offset American withdrawals. The BRICS New Development Bank announced accelerated processing of South African loan applications for projects previously dependent on Western financing. Even traditional American allies, including the European Union, signaled that they viewed Trump's approach as counterproductive and might increase their own engagement with South Africa to prevent total Western disengagement from a strategically important nation. The speed with which alternative financing sources emerged surprised some observers, but reflected a broader reality in an increasingly multipolar world, with multiple potential partners. Economic coercion by any single power faces natural limits, as other powers see opportunities to expand their influence by filling gaps created by American withdrawal. As South Africa navigates this economic transition, and as other nations watch to see whether non-alignment remains economically viable in an era of great power competition, I'll be tracking the development of alternative financing mechanisms, trade diversification efforts, and the broader implications for Western economic influence. Subscribe and enable notifications for continuing coverage. The strategic calculations driving both Trump's decision and South Africa's response reveal fundamental disagreements about the structure of international order and the viability of genuine non-alignment in an era of renewed great power competition. From Washington's perspective, particularly within the Trump administration's worldview, the international system increasingly resembles a zero-sum competition between American-led democratic capitalism and an authoritarian alternative led by China and Russia. In this framework, nations must ultimately choose sides, and attempts to maintain equidistance between competing blocs represent either naivety or disguised opposition to American interests. South Africa's BRICS participation, its voting patterns in international forums, and its refusal to clearly align with Western positions on issues from Ukraine to Middle East policy signaled to Trump's team that Pretoria had effectively chosen the opposing side, making continued American support strategically untenable. South African officials conversely viewed the situation through an entirely different lens, shaped by post-colonial experience and commitment to sovereignty principles. From Pretoria's perspective, genuine non-alignment represented both a principled stance and a practical necessity for a mid-sized power seeking to maximize its options in an uncertain world. Aligning exclusively with the West would limit South African room for maneuver on issues where African interests diverged from Western priorities, while also potentially constraining access to Chinese investment and BRICS cooperation that South Africa needed for its development objectives. Simultaneously moving entirely into an anti-Western camp would jeopardize important economic relationships with Europe and complicate South Africa's role as a bridge between developed and developing worlds. The optimal strategy from South Africa's standpoint involved maintaining multiple partnerships while preserving freedom to make independent judgments on specific issues based on South African national interests rather than bloc loyalty. This fundamental disagreement about whether true non-alignment remains possible made collision increasingly likely, but Trump's specific decision to exclude South Africa from the G20 and terminate aid carried strategic risks that some American foreign policy experts immediately recognized. By making the confrontation so visible and absolute, Trump effectively forced other nations to consider whether they might face similar treatment if they pursued policies Washington opposed. This consideration had potential to accelerate rather than prevent the multipolar fragmentation that American strategy ostensibly sought to contain, as nations concluded that diversifying away from dependence on American-dominated institutions represented prudent risk management rather than anti-American positioning. The BRICS dimension added additional complexity to these strategic calculations. BRICS had long positioned itself as an alternative to Western-dominated global governance. But the bloc's actual capacity to provide concrete alternatives to institutions like the G20 World Bank and IMF remained uncertain and contested. Trump's decision to exclude South Africa provided BRICS with an unexpected opportunity to demonstrate solidarity and showcase alternatives in practice rather than merely rhetoric. China-Russia. Brazil and India all issued statements supporting South Africa's sovereign right to independent foreign policy, but more importantly, they moved quickly to offer concrete alternatives to withdrawn American support. Chinese development financing, Russian energy cooperation, Indian pharmaceutical partnerships, and Brazilian agricultural technology sharing all surged in the weeks following Trump's announcement. The BRICS' new development bank, which had struggled to establish itself as a credible alternative to Western-dominated multilateral development banks, suddenly found itself with enhanced relevance and purpose as South Africa turned to the institution for financing that might previously have come from Western sources. Whether BRICS alternatives could truly match Western institutions in scale efficiency and technical capacity remained an open question. But Trump's coercive approach made the experiment far more urgent and necessary from South Africa's perspective. The greatest strategic irony was that Trump's attempt to punish South Africa for BRICS alignment had the practical effect of forcing South Africa to deepen that alignment and demonstrating to other nations that BRICS alternatives, whatever their limitations, might be necessary insurance against Western economic coercion. Given everything we have examined about these competing strategic frameworks, I'm genuinely curious about your perspective on several interconnected questions. First, can nations truly maintain non-alignment in today's geopolitical environment? Or does multipolarity inevitably force binary choices between competing blocs? Second, did Trump's coercive approach strengthen or weaken American strategic position in competition with China for global South influence? Finally, what does this episode suggest about the future viability of American-led global governance institutions? Share your analysis in the comments. I read them all and often gain insights, particularly from non-Western perspectives, that inform future research directions. Stepping back from the immediate confrontation, what emerges is a portrait of an international system caught between competing visions of global order, neither of which can yet claim definitive ascendancy. The United States, through Trump's decision, asserts a framework where institutional access and economic relationships are conditional on alignment with American preferences, where neutrality is interpreted as disguised opposition, and where great power competition demands that nations choose sides. This vision rests on assumptions about American power and the lack of viable alternatives that may no longer fully correspond to contemporary reality. Yet the alternative vision championed by BRICS and embraced by South Africa of genuine non-alignment within a multipolar system faces its own challenges and uncertainties. Can alternative institutions truly provide the scale, liquidity, and stability of Western-dominated systems? Can middle powers successfully navigate between competing great powers without eventually being forced to choose? The South African case will provide a crucial test of whether the multipolar vision represents a workable alternative or dangerous illusion. Neither outcome is predetermined, and the consequences will shape international politics far beyond this specific bilateral rupture. In the final analysis, Trump's decision to exclude South Africa from the G20 and terminate bilateral aid represents a watershed moment, not because of its immediate material impact, which remains manageable for South Africa, but because of its symbolic and strategic implications for the broader architecture of international order. The decision forces a question that many nations had hoped to avoid: must states ultimately choose between American-led Western institutions and BRICS-led alternatives, or can genuine multipolarity accommodate nations, maintaining simultaneous relationships across multiple frameworks? South Africa's experience navigating this exclusion will provide critical evidence for other middle powers facing similar dilemmas. If South Africa successfully replaces American support through alternative partnerships while maintaining sovereignty and development progress, it demonstrates that non-alignment remains viable and American coercion has limits. If South Africa struggles, it validates Washington's assumptions about the indispensability of the American engagement and the inadequacy of alternatives. Either way, the episode marks another step in the gradual, uneven, but increasingly undeniable evolution from a unipolar post-Cold War order towards something more complex, more contested, and fundamentally more uncertain. Thank you for watching.